and boys, an assembled company, welcome literally to the World Storytelling Cafe in Marrakesh tonight. It is every other Sunday. Well, I don't know when the other Sunday was, but we're not at it. And it's our worldwide story round. And those that have met here regularly on Zoom, like Keith, who is zooming in from Lincolnshire. Is it Lincolnshire or are you Lincolnshire?
No, I'm Wolverhampton.
You're Wolverhampton. Is Lincolnshire, aren't they? No. So they'll be telling. We'll do a few very short stories from here. Good morning. How is things in Lincolnshire, Keith?
Yeah. Oh God, thank you. Yeah. Bit wet and windy, but okay.
Okay. Have you got a Lincolnshire story for us, Bob?
Well, yeah, I've got a different one.
Or any sort of story. Could be Mongolian. I'm not really fast.
Okay, that's fine then. Yeah, okay. Yep.
Well, go ahead.
Oh, now?
Tell the story.
Right, okay.
Tell the story, Keith. You are our opening person.
All right, okay. Okay. Well, there was a young man. He lived a long time ago in a land far away. And God said to him, Jonah, go to Nineveh and warn them that in 40 days I will destroy them, because it's come to my attention how evil they are and all the bad things that they do. But Jonah, because the people that lived in Nineveh, the Assyrians, they were enemies of Israel, he went in the opposite direction. And he went down to Jaffa, to Joppa, and he got on a boat there. He paid his fare on a vessel, a boat, that was going to Tarshish, a mining town on the edge of Spain. But as they sailed along the Mediterranean, the great wind started to blow, the great storm arose, and the boat was in danger of being swamped and drowned and just capsized. And so, the sailors, they didn't know what to do, and they threw some of the cargo overboard, but to no avail. And they prayed to their gods to say, well, to save us and save us. Now the captain went down below, and there was Jonah, and he was fast asleep below decks. And the captain shook him and said, wake up, pray to your God that he might rescue us from this great storm. But Jonah, he went on board went up deck with the captain there, and the storm still was raging. And they decided, well, they cast lots to find out if there was anybody aboard that was causing this great storm and causing the anger of the God that was causing this storm. And the lot fell on Jonah. And they said, who are you? Where are you from? What's your business? And Jonah said, well, I am a Hebrew, and I worship the God that created the earth, the sea, and everything around us. But as I mentioned before, I'm actually running away from what God told me to do, and I'm going the opposite direction. And that's why there's a great storm, because bringing this anger upon us. And the sailor said, well, what shall we do with you? Throw me overboard, and the storm will die down. But they didn't want to do that, and they started to row and row and row and to try to get to a safe harbour, but to no avail. In the end, they threw Jonah overboard. And they cried out to God to forgive them for killing an innocent man. Well, Jonah, he went down, 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 down into the sea. And what should happen? But God commanded a great fish to swallow up Jonah and rescue him, although he's still in the belly of the fish. He cried to God and said, well, thank you, God, for rescuing me. You've heard me from your temple. I was in danger of drowning and being swallowed up and not being able to worship you in your temple. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much for rescuing me. And I worship you. So many people, they worship false gods, but you're the only God that can rescue and save. And God had mercy on Jonah. And he told the fish to vomit up, spew up Jonah onto dry land. And that's what happened. And then God gave him the commission again, said, go to Nineveh and warn them in 40 days. I will destroy them, unless they change their hearts and change their minds about everything they do. And this time Jonah, he went all the way to Nineveh. It's a big city that took 3 days to walk across it. And as he walked, he preached and he told them that in 40 days you'll all be destroyed. Now, much to Jonah's surprise, all the people there, they responded. And they put on sackcloth and ashes. And they repented of all the evil ways and changed their ways. It came to the notice of the king as well. And he took off his royal robes and he put on a sackcloth. And they were hoping that God would change his mind. And when God saw the change of attitude and mind in the part of the people of Nineveh, he didn't destroy them. But Jonah, he was so angry. He was so angry with God. He said, I knew that you are such a merciful God and you would rescue them if I warned them. And this is why I went in the opposite direction and didn't want to go warn them. And he sat on the edge of the city, on the east side of the city there, in the hot sun. And there's a great leafy plant that grew up above him and shaded him from the sun. And he was very grateful for that. But overnight a worm came and ate at the root of that plant and it died. And Jonah was sitting there in the hot sun, seeing that God would change his mind and still destroy the city. But God didn't destroy the city. Jonah was so angry with God, so angry. I just want to die, he says. I knew you were a merciful God. And Jonah, he sat there in the sun, just wanted to die. And God said to him, you were concerned about this plant that you didn't sow, you didn't look after, and it died. Don't you think I should have been concerned about the 120,000 men, women, and children that live in Nineveh? And that's the story of Jonah and the big fish.
Now, we're pretty well. You are the one hybrid person, so you know there's. We can only see the top half of you, but we know the bottom half of you is a fish. So we're now going live in the room. Stay there, please, but enjoy it. Who shall I start with? We're on short stories tonight because I want to be two places simultaneously, and I know Waleed is incredibly powerful as a jinn, but he can't actually do that to me. So Dawn, have you got a 2 minutes or 5 minutes?
Yes, I've got a very short story. Would you like to hear it?
Dawn, yes. Could you do it? Would you like to come
Yes,
here?
right.
Sit next to me. I'm just an excuse to get Dawn sitting.
Once upon a time, there was a wise king and a very popular king, and all went well in his kingdom, and he had one son, and that son grew to be a young man, and the older he grew, the more impatient he got to have responsibility. And he said to his dad, you're an old man now, which he wasn't really. He was certainly a lot younger than you are, John Rowe. I'm just saying. It didn't go down as well as I thought.
He's a bit tired.
He said, send me away, give me something to do or I'll go mad. So the king said, all right, here's some money. Go away and do what you can to make the kingdom secure. Because one of the things you have to do as a king is make the kingdom secure. And so off he went, delighted with his task. And the first thing he did was go to the frontier. It was the frontier, and he said, I'm going to build a castle and make this place secure. And he did it. And he paid for it with taxes from the people. And he took those taxes and he went to another place and he built another castle. And he paid for it with taxes from the people. And finally, he built one more castle and he went back to his father and he said, look what I've done. I've made your kingdom secure for you. And he showed his father the map with the castles on. And his father said, you will never learn. You will never be king if you think that's what makes the kingdom secure. Did you go into the people's houses? Did you make a connection with the people? No. Well then, unless you can do that, you will never be my heir. That's the end of the story.
I have the story that follows that one.
Well, in that case, Norman, you better tell it.
I better tell it.
What places were you
Well, Norman's gonna know.
Did he ever learn the air of his ways?
The king had the traditional setup, 3 sons and 1 kingdom to for leadership, who will be king. So he brought his 3 sons, who were capable ones, and said, one of you must be leader after I am gone. So I'll give you each chest of gold, and what you do with the chest of gold is you will build the biggest and the best house, and whoever builds the biggest and the best house will be king after me. And the first 2 lads took the chest of gold, and they first of all they head to the lumber yards, to the stonemasons, and they started building. Bang, bang, dig, dig, build high and wide. The first 2 sons' houses began to grow wider. There were gardens. There was all sorts of wonderful things. But the 3rd son took his chest of gold and disappeared with it. And they didn't know where he went until word came back of what he was doing with his chest of gold. He was going from town to town to town and throwing storytelling festivals. He was calling all of the musicians, all of the drummers, all of the storytellers. He was calling them, and of course, when there's gold involved, there's lots of storytellers.
Oh, yeah.
And they were telling stories, and the young lad listened to the stories. He learned a few and told a few. And so he went from town to town until he'd gone to every town in the kingdom and bring the storytellers together. Until at last he returned back to the capital where his father was waiting with his 2 sons in judgment of who would be the best king, who would make and so the first 2 sons, we have built high, we have built wide. And the king says, you have done well, and you will make capable ministers for my 3rd son. And because he has built the biggest and the best house, because what he has done is he made the kingdom his home. Everyone knows who he is.
Exactly.
And so there now, for your story, there is a king for that kingdom.
Now, there is someone here who actually just came all the way from England to Marrakesh for this very second, because he only got in a few minutes ago, and we got in for the big feast last night. So you've got to pay for that feast with the story. Can you swap places?
Yes,
so
I
can
can.
get you on camera. Chef,
I'll do that.
right.
Thank you, Norman. There are seats here. Do you want to come and sit down in the seat?
Oh,
yeah. Come sit down in the seats.
You won't be able to.
Yeah, you won't be seen on the camera. You're absolutely fine.
Yeah,
Yeah, come up there.
Yeah, right. Okay. So, Chef, I just because you haven't had so many stories, You've only got 2 seconds for this story, so I'm cutting you on and throwing you off. Get on with it.
Okay, well, since I've only got 2 seconds, I better make sure we lay a few ground rules for this story. Since we've been on the subject of kings, this is a story about an English king whose name was George. He was a bit of a wonky one. He's sometimes known as Mad King George. And this George had a butler whose name was George, and the butler George, he had a workman who built his house. So we've been on the theme of house building as well, and that was a carpenter whose name was George. So before I start the story, I need to let you know that George really fancied George's wife, who we'll call Mrs. George for simplicity. But he couldn't marry Mrs. George while George was in the way, so he went to George to ask for permission to get George out of the way so that he could marry Mrs. George. Are you with me so far?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Are you with me so far? Excellent. You're the most important person in the room. Okay. So, George the butler figured out a really clever way. What he did was he went and studied some ancient calligraphy so that he could write a message which was kind of in this code. And he took it to King George. And King George couldn't read very well, so he passed it to one of his servants to read for him. And his servant said, "Oh, George, it is a message from your father, whose name was George. Your father has made it to heaven." And King George was so relieved at that. His father George had made it to heaven. However, when I got here, there was a shortage of houses. Could you possibly send a carpenter here to heaven so that I can have a nice house built? And King George thought, well, who should I send? Who is the best carpenter? Who is going to be a good enough carpenter? My father. And George the butler said, "I know just the man, sir." And he went and told George the carpenter that he had this important job to do for the king. And George the carpenter was really excited about this. And he came all the way up to the palace to find out what the job was. And King George said to him, "I hear you are a fantastic carpenter." "Oh, that's very kind of you, Your Highness. I'll do my best. So I would like you to build a house for my father." "Your father?" "Yes. Your father who died recently." "That's the one. When can you go?" So George the carpenter realized someone was probably trying to set him up, but he knew he couldn't say anything to the king because that would mean instant. So what he did was he went back and he said to the king, he said, "If it's okay with your highness, could I please have just a few days to make some plans and gather up my things? And then if it pleases your majesty, we can have a big twig burning ceremony to send me off." And the king liked that idea. He liked parties. He liked festivals like this one, as we've already heard. So George the carpenter went back to Mrs. George and told her the awful news that they only had a few days before he was expected to be in heaven. Mrs. George turned to him and said, "Well, we better make best use of the time we've got." A few days later, it was the day of the twig burning ceremony. George the carpenter was there with his tools and he went into the middle of a bonfire. And George the butler took very great pleasure in being the one who set fire to the pyre. And the flames rose up, smoke filled the air, and soon there was nothing left but ashes. And the very next day, George the butler thought, well, Mrs. George has had about a day to get over her husband. So he went there with a nice big bundle of flowers to see if he could woo her. But Mrs. George wasn't very interested. So he waited another week and he went back with exactly the same bunch of flowers and knocked on the door. And Mrs. George still wasn't actually very interested. So he thought he'd give her another week to get over her husband. And he went back and he knocked on the door with exactly the same bunch of stems. And still, for some reason, she wasn't interested. And George the butler was very confused by now, wondering how long it took a woman to get over her dead husband. But after she had gone from the door, Mrs. George picked up a tray of food and went downstairs into the cellar of her house, where George the carpenter was sitting, at the end of a long tunnel that led to where the bonfire had been. And because he had been sat there underground just eating the food that Mrs. George had cooked for him these last few weeks, he had started to grow rather full of himself. But he wasn't just sitting there. He was using his time wisely. He was studying the art of ancient calligraphy. And he was writing a letter, which he rolled up and he popped into his pocket. And at the end of those few weeks, he gathered up his tools, crawled back through the tunnel, came out the other side and shouted, "I'm back from heaven!" Now, a lot of people rushed to see him, including Mrs. George, who was really happy to see her husband after 3 weeks. George the butler was really confused. How had George the carpenter come back from heaven? This wasn't normal. And George the carpenter said, yes, they loved the house that I built for King George II. He thought it was magnificent. I was rich. Look at all the food they've given me these last few weeks. Oh, and that reminds me, actually, King George II gave me a letter for you to deliver to King George III. Could you pass it on for me? So George the butler took this letter and gave it to the king, who couldn't read, so he gave it to his servant, and his servant read it out. "Thank you so much for sending George the carpenter. He has built me the finest mansion. There is just one problem now. I need a butler." Do you know who could go? And King George turned to George the butler and said, "You have been my finest butler ever. I can't think of anyone better to go and serve my father in heaven." And George the butler, you know, he thought about this. He thought, I must have some sort of magical power to send people to heaven, and then they can come back later. So the very next day, they had a twig burning ceremony. George the butler very happily went into that pyre. George the carpenter was given the honor of sending him off, and off he went in all the fire, all the clouds, all the ashes. And do you know what? King George II must have been very happy with George the butler, because unlike George the carpenter, he never came back. Epilogue. Here's my 2-second epilogue. So you see, George the carpenter and Mrs. George, they lived happily ever. They also had a little, who they called Junior. Oh, don't stop it, Rick. I don't like stopping. Claire.
I think the biggest thing about this festival is sharing stories you heard here. And I heard some riddles, very quick riddles. First riddle: how do you get a camel into a fridge in 3 moves?
Say that again.
How do you get a camel into a fridge in 3 moves?
3 moves.
3 moves. Open the door, put the camel in. Close the show. How do you get an elephant into a fridge in 4 moves?
Open the door.
Take
Take
the
it
camel
out.
There is. What's the king of the beasts? Who's the king of the beasts?
The lion.
The king of the beasts. So when the lion has a party, everyone goes, because everyone knows that if you don't go to the party, it's serious trouble. You're gonna never get over it, never gonna be happy where you're living. Lion had a party, biggest, best party it ever had. But there was one animal that didn't go. Who?
The elephant.
The elephant. Last riddle. There once was a boy, this is still in Africa, and he was the one who went to fetch water, and that's really unusual. But there was a crocodile, and he was frightened of this crocodile, because everyone knows crocodiles wait next to the water. You go next to the water, the crocodiles go. And so every day he was terrified of going down to the water. Every day it was would the crocodile get me in? Every day he looked around, saw the crocodile. But there was one day he knew he could go and get water safely. What day was that?
The day of the lion's party.
Yes.
We're gonna speak ladies. Are you ready? Okay, I do like this thing of just having ladies moving next back. It's for everybody. It's children and everything. So it's your turn. Go for it.
You've never been called a lady before.
Now, we all know the parable of the truth and story. Do we all know this one? Yes. No. Okay.
I'm about to learn.
Okay. Truth comes out of the well and goes knocking around, looking for a home, knocking at every door, and everybody's too afraid to open the door. They don't want to talk to truth. And so truth meets story. Truth gets dressed up in story and knocks on everybody's door. Everybody welcomes her in. So here we are. This is the truth. I'd like to introduce you to the truth, but she came naked, screaming from the well, her rage fulfilled by falsity, looking like she'd come from hell to raise a wild cacophony. Well, she had so much to say, and she wouldn't be contained by shyness, shock, or shame. I let her in, but she clawed at my skin, told me strength can lie in suffering, power can lie in understanding. In truth, all lies will shatter silence, but a tree not rooted in honesty will fall in foul weather. I offered food and clothing, fragments of philosophy, ribbons of story. We talked of Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates. We pinned together patches of parable with threads of allegory, dressed up in metaphor. We considered the complexity of bare, naked truth. Then she gave me poetry and handed me the broom.
I've got hairy fella now.
So,
I should have changed it.
it's okay. The reason I'm going to tell this story is because I've been telling it here in Morocco and children have loved it. Now, this story I first heard from a very wonderful storyteller called Helen East, who's done so much work for the storytelling world, but unfortunately now is very ill. And so she can't do it anymore. So in honor of her and in honor of all the children here in Morocco who've heard the story in the last few days, it's this. Once there was a farmer and his wife, and they were hungry. They had nothing to eat for their dinner. So the farmer went out, he took his gun and he looked. He looked here, he looked there, he looked there. He was looking for something to eat. And as he was walking, he heard, la, oh, voice is gone. La, capuilla, bang, bang, capuilla, bang. La, capuilla, he didn't know where it was coming from. He looked there, he looked up, and then he looked up. And up there he saw a whole flock of geese flying around. So he took his gun, he took a bang, and flying from the sky came a goose.
That was the hardest riddle we've had.
And he picked it up, thank you very much. He picked it up and he put it on his shoulder and he started walking home. But as he walked, he heard Lalilu Capuilla, Capuilla, ba ba Capuilla, Lalilu Capuilla, Capuilla, ba ba. Why, here, that's a queer bird. Get it ready, cook it, and we'll eat it. So the wife, she started plucking all the feathers. But as she plucked the feathers, every feather that she plucked flew out of the window. And as it flew, it sang, la li lu la la well, she put it in the oven. After she plucked it, she set the fire, she started cleaning, started polishing. But every time she cleaned and she polished, she heard from inside the oven. What's going on? This bird is a queer bird. It was finished, and she opened the oven door and she took out with her oven gloves. She took out that bird, put it on the table, and she said, "Husband, it's ready." He took his carving knife, he took his carving fork, and he was just about to take the fork and slice with the knife. When coming in through the window was 1, 2, 3, 10, 20, 30, 100 birds, geese flying about in the kitchen. Each bird had a beak. Well, birds generally have a beak, but not in another story I'm telling. And in each beak of the bird there was a feather. They flew down and stuck all their feathers into the bird, kept flying above, and the bird slowly raised up and went into the air and flew with his brothers and sisters around once, around twice, around 3 times around that kitchen table and out through the window. And that night, the farmer and his wife, all that they had for their dinner was an empty plate and a song. La-dee-doo, umbrella, umbrella, bum, bum, umbrella, bum. La-dee-doo, umbrella, umbrella, bum, bum, umbrella, bum.
I think I can start a story for us now.
The easiest way to find the way to Riyadh is that there's a barber shop right across the dark alley you have to go through. And that made me think of this story. There was once a barber who was lazy. He was so lazy. He was always taking nicks out of people's faces, lopping off bits of ears. And there is a rumor going about that he actually slit someone's foot. Oh. Well, you can imagine that his business fell off rapidly. And pretty soon there was no money. And when he came home that day with no money, his wife said, "Husband, it's time for you to go out and beg in the streets." Beg in the streets. What'll I beg for? Don't even beg in the street. She says, "Why don't you go to the king and ask him for something?" Something? Yes, anything, something. So the barber went off to the palace and he was given witness to the king. And he said, "Your Majesty, I'm in need of something." "What sort of something?" "I don't know. Anything." And the king said, "How can you get this? Let's see. I have a piece of wasteland over there that nobody's doing anything with. I'll give him a deed to that land and he can go home with something." So he went home with the deed to his wife. And he showed her, he says, "Wife, wife." She was waiting. She says, "You got money? Because I've got to go shopping so I can make out supper." "No, my dear, I don't, but I have something. I have a piece of land." "A piece of land? You Egypt, you nincompoops, you doorcock. What are we going to do with a piece of land?" Now, his wife was sharply even at his razor, so it was sort of unpleasant dealing with her. She thought, though, she was clever, unlike the barber, she was very clever. And she said to him, "Tomorrow, I want you to come with me and do everything I do, but keep your mouth shut and don't say a word." Now, they didn't have an oxen to go with her. She was creative. She was thinking about this all night. In the morning, they got up, they went to the land, and she said, "Well, as I said, just follow me, do everything I do, and don't sound." So the wife was walking around the bare piece of land, looking intently at every clod or dirt. every stone. And her husband followed behind her. She looked and she looked and she looked. She didn't say anything, but hiding in the bushes over at the end of that was a band of 7 robbers. They were watching her very carefully. They became curious. What's this woman doing walking around this piece of deserted land? Finally, they decided to go ask her. As soon as they got near, she stood up and started staring at the sky. Her husband stood up and started staring at the sky. Finally, the chief of the robbers came and said, "What are you doing, madam?" "Oh, well," she said, "I inherited this piece of land, but my father who left it to me did not tell me where he put the pot of gold that I was to inherit. I don't want to go digging up everything. I kind of like to get a vibration from the ground to see if I can tell where it is." And the robber said, "Oh, that's very interesting." She went on to say, "I'm getting tired now. I think I'll go home and come back tomorrow." And away they went. As soon as the sun went down, you can guess what happened. The robbers came out with every hammer and shovel. They began to dig. They dug up furrows one way, furrows back, furrows one way, furrows back. By the time morning came, the whole field had been plowed. Along came the woman and saw her beautifully plowed piece of land. She went to the corn merchant. She got seeds on credit. And she sowed seeds on that piece of land. And before long, she had a lovely crop of grain. She took it to the market and ended up with a pot of gold. She sold it. When the robbers heard about this, they came pounding on the door. "You cheat! We're the ones that helped you dig up that land. You owe us half that gold you got paid in return." She said, "I told you there was gold in that land, but you didn't quite understand what I meant. And see, I'm not going to give you a penny of it." Oh, the robbers were mad. They were going to get it. They all went off to consult. They hid in the bushes near the house. The woman went back in the house and said to her husband, "I have the gold now, and they're not going to get any of it." But her husband said, "Well, I hope you hid it in the same place." She said, "Oh, yes, I have." And she looked out of the corner with my eyes. Creeping around the corner, she saw the robber. She picked it up. "I hid it in a safe place," she said, "a very safe place. I hid it in a jar of pickles, underneath the pickles." Her husband went to bed. The robber chief, or it was the chief, went in, took the jar of pickles, took it back to his friends, and they carried it out into the forest to a dark, moonlit place. And they were ready to find that gold. But they said, "Well, we might as well eat the pickles too, after all." They started to eat what they thought was the pickles. But I'll tell you what she'd done. She put all the household garbage, including a couple of dead rats, including and all that sort of thing. The first robbers began to eat, and they went, "This is awful. This is garbage. She tricked us. What a nasty, mean woman. We're going to get even with her." Well, they sneaked around that night and kept an eye on things. They always had a scout who would spy. And now the woman's husband, the barber, said, "My dear wife, I hope you hidden the money in a safe place tonight. You shouldn't put it under the pillow or anything like that." There was a robber hiding down to the left side of the room, and she looked over and she said, "I've put it in a safe place, husband. It's up in a bag in the top of the tree outside. No one will ever think to look there." Well, as soon as the lights went out in the house, up the tree went the first of the thieves. He went up, 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 up. There's a bit of moonlight. They could see him up on the top of the tree. And as they watched him down below, the robber went, "You thief, you! You're up there stealing the gold before we can see how much you have." "No, I'm not. No, I'm not." And then all of a sudden something else hit him and he snapped at his pants. The other robber said, "You're putting gold into your pocket." "No, I'm not. Something bit me." The second thief said he would go up and find out what was going wrong and tell that first robber what for. Up he went and the same thing happened to him. Something began to pinch him, pinch him, pinch him. The third robber said, "What are you two doing up there? You're stealing all the gold for yourselves." Third robber went up. Same thing happened to him. And on it went. Every robber went up the tree until the tree was beginning to be a little uneasy at the top. And what was there was not a bag full of gold, but a hornet's nest. And the hornets were busy stinging the robbers. The chief of the robbers finally came up and said, "I'm going to deal with this." He reached out to grab the bag when the branch broke and they all landed smack on the ground. The hornet's nest burst and stung all the robbers from head to toe. Off they went to the hospital and they were gone for a long time. And now the barber's wife began to think, maybe they've finally given up and gone away. Possibly they've forgotten about the whole issue. They were in the hospital. What could they do about it? Time passed. Time passed. It got warmer. When it gets warm in that part of the world, it's nice to sleep outside on your low bed in the cool air. So she and her husband went out to sleep. By now, the robbers were heading for revenge. When they saw the couple sleeping, they said, "Aha, now we will carry this nasty woman away and get even with her." They picked up the bed and began to carry it away up on top. Of they were holding their hands up, holding the bed up, and they marched along through the night. But after a while, they got tired. "This barber's wife is so heavy. Let's stop and have a rest." They stopped to have a rest. But as they stopped, the barber's wife saw a branch hanging down from the tree above where they stopped. She grabbed the branch and jumped up into the tree and went up. Eventually, most of the robbers fell asleep, except for the captain, who was walking around. He didn't go to sleep. No, he didn't go to sleep. And I have forgotten one of the other episodes that you should have heard before this. There's Plan B. Plan B. So let's revisit Plan B. They decided to crawl into the bedroom window outside the barber's house. The first robber went up, opened the window, and the barber's wife heard him. And the only thing she had at hand was the razor of the barber, which was still quite sharp. She waited by the window, and as the first robber walked in, snap, off went the chicken's nose. And fell down. "My nose, something bit me." "There was nothing to bite you up there. You probably just got it caught on a." Something robber said, "Never send a boy up into a match to be rich." Step off with the tip of his nose. And so it happened until all 6 of the robbers had had the tips of their noses cut off. The head of the robbers was very proud of his nose. He had no intention Now seeing what was happening to his friends, he thought it might be wise to take a break. And they all went off to the hospital. And the barber's wife kept all the tips of their noses in a little box and stuff. Now we can fast forward to the other part. Now there is the barber's wife. The robber chief looked up and he thought, there's something up in that tree. She began to sing. She began to sing some stuff. He thought, oh, that looks like a fairy. I expect she's in love with me. It's always very nice when a fairy falls in love with you. So he went over and he looked up and said, ah, you've fallen in love with me, haven't you? You admire my long actor line. This is a good phrase. Come down, beautiful fairy. I will be your love. Oh no, she said, I will not come down, but you can come here. So the robber chief climbed up to the branch above. He said, oh, I admire you so much. I know I will be faithful. He said, how do I know you will be faithful? Oh, I am the most loyal and faithful love you would ever. Well, she said, my mother told me the only way to tell if a man is going to be faithful is to stick out the tip of your tongue and touch the tip of the other person. Then you'll be able to tell. And the robber took his tongue. She bit his tongue right off. Ooh. Ouch. The robber fell down to the floor. Screaming and yelling, and everybody woke up and they said, what's the matter? What's the matter? He said, well, off they went. She'd really fooled them that time. They decided it was time to give up and take her to court and sue her. So they ended up in tears. And she gave her evidence to the judge. She showed him a little box she had with the 6 tips of noses and the tip of the chief robber's tongue. And the judge was so impressed. She won the case, and furthermore, they appointed her husband as prime minister because they said, any man who is married to such a clever woman will never make a bad decision.
I can hand over to Bubba C, who's going to invite Alistair up to be our next talent. No complication there. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're on the World Wide Web. Way to Bubba C. You might have seen it before. And Alistair, you're going to come and tell the story. You've been asked. You've done this sort of thing before.
Yes, I have. I've done this before.
You've done it.
Yeah, I've done it with a very talented person called John Brooks.
Oh, God. Oh, yeah. Don't have anything doing him. I'm running off before he comes back.
He's running away.
So, oh,
Thank you. All right. Now, just before Alex tells you his story, I have to tell you something about him. He is an incredibly interesting man and a wonderful storyteller. And we just, well, I have nothing else to say.
Thank you for that. I really don't know what to do with that. John Rowe has just escaped, and the reason he's just escaped is that I was about to pick on him for wearing a white shirt. Because as men of a certain age, when we start getting grey in our beards, know that white shirts are really not the best thing to be wearing, particularly anywhere where you eat food that has tomato in it or anything red in it. because as you reach a certain point where you inevitably end up with as much food down your front as you do in your mouth. And this is why I'm wearing a dark colour, because we're going out for dinner, so I don't want to end up as John is going to end up later. And grandfather wore a white shirt, and grandfather kept getting the food down his shirt. And mother and father would sit at the table and tut, and their children would look on and see how their parents treated grandfather. And in the end, mother said to grandfather, "You are so clumsy, I don't think we can trust you with a china and a metal spoon. You have a wooden bowl and a wooden spoon, because you drop food down your front, you drop food on the table, you are too clumsy to have something so precious on the table." So the children watched as their grandfather was given a wooden spoon and a wooden bowl next time. Now, I don't know if you've ever tried to eat soup from wood. Soup clings to wood. So the effect of that was to make it 10 times worse. There was not just as much down his front, there was more down his front and on the table. And father said, "Oh, for goodness sake, grandfather, what a mess you make. Next time when you eat with the wooden bowl and the wooden spoon, but you do it on the floor."
Whoa.
So the next meal, grandfather sat on the floor and his grandchildren watched as he tried to balance a wooden bowl and a wooden spoon and eat soup. You can guess what the result was. "Oh, grandfather," said mother and father together, "what a mess you're making. Tomorrow for the meal, you do not sit at table with us. You do not sit on the floor. You can eat from the pig's trough outside." So the next meal, the children did not watch their grandfather, because he was outside eating soup from the pig's trough while they sat at table with their mother and father. The next day was market day. So off went mother and father to market, leaving the children to play, and grandfather, quite hungry, of course, by now, because it's really quite difficult to eat soup from a pig's trough. When they came home from the market, they found the children doing crafts. Playing at crafts. They were having a darn good go. They found a bit of wood, they found a saw, they found some nails. Anybody who's been a teacher like me is immediately doing a risk assessment. But I'm going to try and put that to the side and ignore the risk assessment now. But they had the nails, they had the hammers, they had the saw. And then mother and father came home from market and they said to the children, "What are you playing at?" And the children said, "We're making a surprise. We're making a surprise for you." And mother and father went, "Oh, a surprise for us, how lovely. Oh, go on, tell us what you're making." And the children said, "We're making a pig's trough for you for when you get old." So the next meal, grandfather sat at table with a china bowl and a metal spoon. And if he got a little bit of soup down his white shirt, who cared? Because the family ate together.
Okay, but Alistair just proved me right. He is an interesting fellow and a very good storyteller. Now, Keith, what can I tell you about Keith? What can I tell you about Keith?
Can you tell me about?
Well, I know that the moment I met you, I felt the vibrations of a storyteller who was keen of wit and able to tell. So without further ado, and one I don't, the table is yours.
Keen of wit and able to tell. Jury stood out on that. But I would like to tell you a story about a young girl with a red cloak and a red hood. Now, villages are places that like to give people names. So she shuttled back and forth to her mum's house on the edge of the woods. They like to call her Red Riding Hood. You've guessed that already. And Red Riding Hood's grandmother lived in the middle of the woods in quite a big house because her husband had been a woodcutter and made plenty of money. Story often says it's a tiny, but it's a big house. And for her 10th birthday, she bought Red Riding Hood a brooch. And the brooch was big round brooch with a beautiful red stone in the middle. And Red Riding Hood used that to pin her cloak together, and she put her Red Riding. Now, again, villagers love a rumour, don't they? And they go, "Whoa, that's a ruby. That's a ruby in that brooch. What's her grandmother thinking of? Giving her such an expensive brooch and walking around in it. There are robbers." Wow, foolish woman, she must be going mad in the head, and she goes visiting through the woods all the time, and there is that ruby, but it was just a nice red glass ruby brooch. But so the rumour persisted. Now on this day, her grandmother had been ill, so her mother packed up a bag of food with meat and sweetmeats and fruit, and she said, "I want you to take that to your grandmother, go straight there down the path, you know the path well, but be careful of wolves." She was a good girl, she nodded and said yes to her mother, and she'd never seen a wolf. In all her time going back and forth through the woods, she'd never seen a wolf. But she set off happily because it was a path she knew, and she liked visiting her grandmother. Grandmother was a bit of a character, and it was fun to sit in her big kitchen with her and hear her stories. What she didn't know, or mother didn't know, passing by was a woodcutter, a big brute of a man, and he had heard about the ruby brooch. Meanwhile, Red Riding Hood is off down the woods, and it is that beautiful path, you know, on a sunny day when it's a dappled floor, when the sun is coming through the trees. There's no nicer sight than that. And she's whistling to herself as she walks through the woods, but halfway to Granny, she hears this strange whining noise, and she stops and she puts her bag down, and she listens again, and it's not a whining, it's a whimpering. You can't understand it, and she knows she shouldn't, but she must find out what that sound is. And she walks into the wood, and there, in a clearing, is a wolf lying on the floor, whimpering. And because it looks so unhappy and she's a nice girl, she bites back her fear and walks towards it. And sure enough, as she gets there, she sees a huge thorn sticking out of the wolf's paw. And it whimpers again. And she knows she's got to help it. And she reaches forward and she takes the thorn out. And the wolf shudders with pain and slumps to the floor, and there's a spot of red blood on the dust. And she makes her way straight out of the wood, back on the path, and picks up her handclap. Meanwhile, the woodcutter has made his way by a different route to grandmother's house, and he's barged in through the door, and he's gone upstairs, and poor grandmother, who is ill, is lying in the bed, and he manhandles her out and shoves her in a cupboard and shuts the door, and he climbs into the bed and he puts a bonnet on. When Little Red Riding Hood arrives, she comes through the door. She realizes her grandmother must be upstairs in bed. She puts a hamper on the kitchen table and makes her way upstairs. And there, hidden by the bedclothes and the bonnet, are the eyes of the woodcutter, who tries to make some semblance of being a granny and says, "Hello, my dear," in this incredible, no, sorry, that was too high, nearly a granny voice, wasn't it? "Hello, my dear." Red Riding Hood says, Granny, you are unwell. You don't sound a bit like yourself." But with that, he throws the covers back and says, "Enough of this." And he grabs his axe and he chases Red Riding Hood all round the house, but she knows the house well, and she runs from room to room upstairs, and he almost catches her. Then she runs down the stairs, and from room to room downstairs, with the woodcutter chasing her with his axe, and finally she's pinned against the hob with the woodcutter glaring at her, panting because he's so angry at having to chase her, and he lifts his axe up high and he says, "I'll have it now." And that moment, the door crashes open and the wolf bursts in. And he springs on the woodcutter and he grabs the shaft of his axe. And the two fight for control of the axe. They crash into the Welsh treasure and the plates fall off. They crash into the table and knock a chair over. All the while, Red Riding Hood, with wide eyes and mouth agape, is watching this strange brawl. Eventually, they fall on the floor, they roll over, woodcutter's on top. But the wolf wrenches the axe out of his hand and hits him on the shoulder. With a scream, he jumps up and runs out the door. And the wolf lies there, panting after the fight. And then he looks up. Red Riding Hood is looking on, amazed. But the wolf just nods, walks out of the kitchen, out to the door. Now, grandmother has escaped from the cupboard by now. Made her way down the stairs and hears this commotion. But she arrives with just the wolf's tail vanishing out of the door like that. And she looks at Red Riding Hood and says that thing that every grandmother in the world would say at a time like this. "Well, dear, after an adventure like that, I think we need a nice cup of tea." The inspiration to this story is Norman Perrin, who was once in a hospital telling stories, and a child said to him, "I want to hear Red Riding Hood, but I want the wolf to be the hero." Yeah. I wrote that good. I was lucky enough to tell it on Zoom to Norman on his last birthday. So there you go.
Now I've heard it myself.
I go back to my stuff.
So I'm gonna close out. Yes. Getting signs. Close out, close out. I'm gonna close out. And I'm gonna do it a little bit differently. First of all, let's have a round of applause for all the wonderful tellers. Now, some of you may be tempted to retell the tales that were told tonight, and we encourage that. For a tale well told is worth the retelling. Remember that if you tell a story more than once, you ate more than once, you got dressed more than once. So when something is good for you and good to you, you do it again and again. Yeah. So I'm going to end with a story that I started off, the third edition of the Marrakesh International Storytelling Festival with. Oh, wait, correction.
Yes.
The
Correct.
Guinness World Ranking. Yeah. 80 hours non-stop storytelling. So we just learned that last night. So did you want to say something?
No, I was just saying, yes, well done, keep going.
Yes. So I tell a story about the cowtail switch. I'm going to shorten it just a little bit so that we can stay within our time frame. Now, this is a cowtail switch. And I learned the last time I told that here in Marrakesh, that there's not a word for cowtail switch in Arabic. So for those that may not know, this is a cow's tail. It has been attached to a switch or a branch, and then, some ornate covering and stuff, so that one can do stuff like this and look cool. Now, you see, this story, when it was originally told, was told a long time ago. Whoa. I wasn't just gonna make it that time. My voice has been on the fritz today. So, a long time ago, there was a fierce hunter. How fierce was he? There was a fierce hunter. He was so fierce that when it rained, the water did not fall on him. He was so fierce that when an animal saw who was hunting him, it just dropped dead. Well, one day Amagogo got up to go hunting and did not come back. He was gone for 2 weeks. No, that's not right. It was 14 days. No, He was gone for a week and 7 days. And the women got up every morning to go tend to the field and to watch after the children, and the other men got up to go hunting. Now, Amagogo had sons, and one day his youngest son sat up and said, "Where is my father?" Everybody in the Kijiji in the village stopped. What? Where is my father? And at that instant, everyone realized that they had not seen Amagogo for 7 days and 1 week. Well, Amagogo had some very talented sons, and they said, "We must find our father. We don't know where he is, but we must find him." So he had a son who could track everything. He could see the slightest bent leaf. He could see the slightest indentation on the ground. And he said, "I will find father." And so they followed him. And he followed them this way. He followed them that way. They followed him that way. They followed him that way until they got to a clearing where father was, or what was left of father. So there were just scattered bones in the clearing. Everybody go, "Oh, thank you." And they said, "What are we going to do? All that's left of our father are bones." One son said, "I will reassemble the bones until we have a whole skeleton." And so he found even the smallest little chip, and he constructed a whole skeleton. And then the other son said, "I will put sinew and muscle on the bone." And this he did. Another son said, "I will cause there to be blood to pump through the sinew and muscle." And this he did. And then another son said, "I will cover this with skin so it will look like father." And that he did. And another son said, "I can only do this once, but I will breathe the gift, the breath of life into father." And he blew. Everybody blow. Oh, no, stop. I keep forgetting not to do that. Oh. Amagogo's body shook, and he sat up, and he looked around, he saw his son surrounding him, and he said, "Why are you all looking at me? And where are we, and where are my clothes?" And they explained he'd been gone for 14 days. "No, father's been gone for 2 weeks. No, he's been gone for a week and..."
I thought he was on for a fortnight.
That's another story. It's also a video game, but that's another story. So they decided, he said, "We must go back to the Kijiji, that means village, and we must have a celebration." So on the way back, Amagogo looked at a bison, he looked at Amagogo, it dropped dead. Amagogo saw some birds flying overhead, and he looked at them, and some of them looked at him, and they dropped dead. By the time they get back to the Kijiji, that means village, they had all this food, and they had to fix it and prepare it. And you know what happens when you put music, dance, and food together? You have a party. A party is what you go to. A party is what you are. Everybody say party! And that's what they did. They partyed until the early hours of the morning. They danced until they couldn't dance anymore. They sang until they couldn't sing anymore. The drummers drummed until they couldn't drum anymore. And they ate until they couldn't eat anymore. And then one by one, two by two, etc., they all went off to their homes to sleep. The next morning, Amagogo got up and he went walking, reflecting upon his miraculous return. And in the field, he saw a long cow's tail. And he picked it up and he attached it to a branch and he covered it and he made it look ornate. Now, some people say the cow's tail was used to keep the flies off of you because this story took place before we had air conditioning. And some people said cow tail switches were used to discipline children and make them see the errors of their ways. When Amagogo would walk around, he would think. And when Amagogo would talk, everyone would listen. And everybody wanted the cow tail switch. Everybody say, "I want that." And so they offered Amagogo many things. One person offered him 3 goats. Another one offered him a cow. Somebody else offered him 3 goats and 3 cows. Somebody else offered him 3 wives. But his wife said no. And Amagogo got tired of people trying to buy the cowtail switch. He said, "The cowtail switch is not for sale. But when I die, the child that did the most to save me will inherit the cowtail switch." Well, all the sons started arguing. "Well, I deserve the cowtail switch because I found our way to father." "Yes, but you were just a bunch of bones and I reassembled the bones." "Yes, but I put sinew and muscle on the bones. Yes, but I put skin so it would look like Father. Yes, but I cause it to be blood to course through the sinew and bone. And yes, but I breathe the breath of life into Father. I was going to ask you guys to go again, but I'm not going to make that mistake. And Amagogo said, enough. When I join the ancestors, the cowtail switch will go to Pele. Here we go. Pele? Yes, it will go to Pele. Now everybody say, but he didn't do anything.
But he didn't do anything.
Ah, yes, he did. Well, I had been gone for 14 days. No, that was a week and 7 days. No, that was a fortnight. He said, but no one missed me. No one thought about me until Pele sat up and said, where is my father? And so on that eventful day, when Amagugo joined the ancestors, Pele inherited the cowtail switch. Now, why am I ending the story with this? Because the cowtail switch and the story thereof, it highlights why we tell stories. For as long as you tell stories about things and places, as long as you tell stories about people, as long as you share the adventures of your friends and your relatives and people you may not know, as long as storytellers exchange stories with each other, a person can never truly die, for they will reside on in our hearts, in our minds, in our souls. And that is why we tell stories, and that is the tale of the cow tail switch. So I'm Baba C, sitting in for John Rowe. You know what I like? I like to kid John Rowe. I introduce him as Rowe, John Rowe, with license to tell. But once again, let's have a round of applause for all the wonderful storytellers. Let's give it up. Let's give it for Wami and all the techno magic. Let's give it up for the Storytelling Cafe. And if I missed anybody, let's give it up for them. And the audience. Let's give it up for the audience. Particularly the loud one over there.
Thank you.
So we hope that you enjoyed this gathering of tellers. And we hope that you've enjoyed and taken away something tonight. And Keith, we gave it up for you as well. Just remember, as food is nourishment for the body, stories are nourishment for the soul.
Yeah.
Asante Sana, thank you very much. Until the next time.